Most people in the room, if not everybody, will know Terry because he's been in the village for some time and has done an awful lot in terms of the history of the village. Very briefly, he did an archaeology degree at Newcastle University. He did some work at a place in Warwickshire called Tripontium. Thank you. And then he did some work in Somerset at a village called Donyat, Taunton Castle and Wells Cathedral. So he's done quite a lot. He went to Newcastle University, as I say. Then he went to Northants, so he came south. He went to Northants to do some work at a place called Raund, R-A-U-N-D. He then got involved in drugs and alcohol in Northants. Which sounds like he got on the wrong side of things, but actually it was quite respectable because it was to do with commissioning drug and alcohol services there. He and Helen moved to Herefordshire, to Leintwardine, about, 5 or 6 years ago? Five. And that was for family reasons. So, and then, of course, since he's been here, he's done an awful lot of work in terms of the Letton Mill excavation and the work on the history of St Mary's Church. So Terry has made a very significant contribution already to Leintwardine and the history and archaeology of the area. Anyway, enough from me. So could I ask you to welcome Terry in the usual way? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It was an abbreviated outline, and I did a second degree, higher degree at Birmingham University in commissioning, which was why I was doing the drug and alcohol commissioning for public health, believe it or not. The reason why I moved out of archaeology and into that was quite straightforward. At the time, I was studying ceramics, and I was publishing articles on ceramics. And what happened was when they started to privatise it, to change the rules and the law, the move was to actually bag the material rather than study it. So effectively it took the job away that I was doing, and I dropped out and went into the public health from that, although it's always been a passion and an interest of mine throughout. Now tonight we're going to talk about the village, the Roman village, what it looked like, because there's controversy and different opinions all the way across the board. It's a lovely village, and you can see from the air photograph, which is probably one of the better ones of it, what it looks like. I'm not going to go into that one in too much detail at the moment, because we've got to bring it up later on when I can illustrate particular things from it. First of all, archaeology. Archaeology is a process of finding the evidence of the past, and then build it into a story. And as each new bit of evidence comes along, it changes the story. Now, this was known as a sort of alternative hypothesis theory, and it was first brought out through Oxford University under a series of dealing with how to deal with prehistoric archaeology. Because you eventually get this sequence of events, and then your sequence of ideas of what the events or the evidence might be, and the one which fits most of the evidence is at the top. And that's what we do here. We look at all the evidence that we've got and we try and build that picture. And that's what I'm going to do tonight, because it offers us a different view of the village, and it starts to put the village in the centre rather than small Roman towns in England or Britain, what they look like and how they operated in a national picture. It says what happens locally, which is what I'm trying to look at tonight. So, where this actually came from. So when I first arrived in the village and looked and had the first meeting in the LHS resource room, which if you haven't been, you ought to go, there was a model. And the model been produced as a lovely model, been produced as a picture of what the Roman town might have looked like. I have to say my reaction to it at the time was very much that it wasn't a Roman town, it was a medieval town. It was nothing like what a Roman town that I understood it would look like. And so I did some work around that. And then later, in fact last year, I was talking to a group of primary school children who came to visit the history room, and I described Leintwardine as a motorway service station. It sits on the main road. It services people walking up that road, and it functions in a very similar sort of way. And this is a very good way of talking to the children. But several members who were there at the same time said, we've never heard that before. Hence, I'm doing this talk. Okay, inevitably though, the answer to this is very nuanced. I'm going to skim through quite a lot of the evidence tonight to bring it into a usable time frame. But there's a lot more detail to it. And just to add, because we can bring this back later, we have finally located all of the finds from the Stamford excavations, which were the main excavations across the town and bathhouse. And we will be organising a visit to Ludlow to see that material. And keep your eyes peeled on the website, because we'll announce it. And if we can take a group of people down who'd like to see that material, they'll be welcome. Right, primary sources. I likened the work that's happened on Leintwardine to the historic England, because they're the people who do all of the business end of making sure you can't do anything in your gardens, to Leintwardine being a Chinese torture of death by small cuts. They sanction small cuts all over the place, and nobody is putting it all together. It just comes out as a whole series of small cuts. So this is a first start of how we might begin to do that. So these are the primary sources that we're using. The first one, by Peter Dorling, is probably the most important, because it'll give you references to all of the rest if you wanted to follow it through, or any particular site. It was the main piece of work that was done for Herefordshire archaeology, and it still stands as the most important. But it doesn't focus on Leintwardine as Leintwardine, and perhaps doesn't bring the synthesis that we want to see coming out on the Roman town out very well. But have a read. It is very good, and it does cover a lot of things. Okay, Stamford was the main excavator, and he excavated the main sites in the 60s, published in 1968 in a series of papers in the Woolhope Journal. And then he tried to fit Leintwardine into a Roman fort, or rather a Roman fort into Leintwardine. Hence his title, The Roman Forts of Leintwardine and Buckton. And then Brown came along about, 20 years later, and he looked at that, and then he looked at a lot of small excavations that had taken place, and he put all the small excavations into a larger paper and rediscussed it, not as a fort, but as a town, the small Roman town of Leintwardine. So we have this dichotomy between the main excavators, where they're calling it a fort on the one hand and a town on the other. And then finally, we've reached an interesting point in archaeology whereby we see new historians using archaeological data and coming to conclusions which the archaeologists had never got near. Now, this is primarily because of what they call the grey data. It's the data that we digitally put on to the national database, and it's massive, and it allows historians like that to actually synthesize the archaeology. And if you want a really good read, there are two books by Robin Fleming, The Material Fall of Roman Britain and Britain After the Romans, which are really well worth reading. Right. First thing we need to consider is the landscape. The one thing you know about Roman forts is they like to put their fort in a place where they've got good views all the way around. Not on a south-facing slope where you can't see to the north or the east very well. So it's not an ideal spot for a Roman fort. That's first off. This map on this side is the 1908 Ordnance Survey. And you can see it's probably the best one for the recording of what was seen as the defences at the time. Okay, so if you haven't seen it, it's well worth seeing that. And it's got the main things on there. I will draw your attention to this now, but we'll pick it up later as we go through. On this side, you've got a whole series of haphazard enclosures, all running all the way down the side. And on that side, against Church Street, you've got a division, right the way down to the bottom there, and that is completely split in two. And that actually is really quite important, and we'll discuss that as we get further on. So what has brought this settlement here? It is probably that it's the river crossing. and little else. So within the landscape of the Roman period, what have we got? We've got Leintwardine, J Lane, and then we've got Brandon Camp, and we've got Pato Lane going right through here. Now this illustrates an interesting conundrum. Stamford excavated at Buckton Fort, and he excavated at J Lane, and he excavated at Leintwardine. Freer excavated at Brandon Camp. These two, the Walford Marching Camp and the Brampton Bryan Marching Camps, have never been excavated. We don't know anything about them, except the size of this one is massive. And if that's a true marching camp, it would have catered for about 2,000 men. And that's interesting because Freer at Brandon Camp found a granary which was sufficient in size to feed 2,000 men. Okay, we do not have any granary in Leintwardine yet at all. We have no evidence of it. Now Buckton Fort over here and J Lane, as we'll go through earlier on. J Lane finishes quite early. The earliest site in the area is Brandon Camp. And that operates around 50 to 55 AD, 55 around that time. And it was only operating for about 5 years. And is often seen as a campaign. So they brought all the materials down, stored them up here with a small detachment. They had a processing camp and then the legionary. And you know why that is? The Roman army marched on corn. It was bread. This is a beef area. Cattle. They weren't growing arable crops at all. We have no evidence of it yet. So what happens is they have to bring it all down here first in order to supply their army. Now, one or two people have put this down to be Caractacus and the battle with Caractacus, and that would point off in that direction. The interesting reason I mention this at the moment is that when we looked at this road, which is the Roman road, it heads up towards Gloucester. So it goes up towards Magnus and then across towards Gloucester. But this section of the road here is of an entirely different type of construction than the piece from Brandon over towards Wigmore. And the hypothesis would be that that is later, when they were building the Watling Street east, dubbed in this direction to join in a piece of road they'd already created. What we do know is that Stamford said he'd found not only baths at Buckton, Roman baths, but also a mancio. Now that would imply some sort of regional government or somebody who's an official of standing there. But if that is the extension of Watling Street, what's it doing over there? That would imply that it's moving out in that sort of direction. And indeed, I believe the Victus Vicus, or the civilian settlement, is on that side, and there's a road out in that direction. So just put it into the landscape. Now, these marching camps are incredibly rare. This is the biggest collection in England, in one area. Okay, and it makes the study of these in this area particularly important, because we can begin to understand what's going on. So, how do these affect Leintwardine? The next thing we need to do is to look at the LiDAR and the archaeology. First of all, Mike Ricks and myself, when we were walking across the bottom of the area down here, located what appeared to be a causeway, and you can see it. You can see the ditch there, and you can see there's one comparison with it alongside it. And they're heading right down to that junction. Now this is LiDAR, it's showing you the underground map, if you like, of what's there. And you can see from this that the river might well have taken an entirely different course earlier and probably joined in much lower down, which meant that the river crossing over there was across the Clun. And then you've got a causeway which goes directly out to Buckton Camp in that direction. Now, I would suggest that that is probably Iron Age and used by the Romans. But it is quite interesting to see. Now, again, this emphasises quite clearly the difference in the two sides of Leintwardine. This side we have a whole series of lynchets, and you can see the different lynchets going down the side. and this side we have property boundaries going across. In this LiDAR version here, and this was actually shown to us and allowed us to use by David Lovelace, all of the buildings are in yellow. And the reason for that is so that we can cancel them out of the contours that we're looking at. And you can see again the same sort of ridges that we've got on there, but you can see them in more detail. We will come back to this one later, because not only have we got the patterns inside, but you'll notice that up the other side of Watling Street there, on the current Watling Street, you have what the equivalent of medieval Burgage Hydes plots look like. So this shows you, again, this is from Peter Dawling's work, all of the areas that have been investigated are in green and across saddles. That means that they've been kept an eye on, they've been looked at, and they consider them excavated or looked at because of the red, which is the excavation. Now, on the one hand, this is quite a lot, but on the other hand, this is very little to actually base all of the conclusions on. So, we found burning in 2 or 3 of these, suggested by Stanford that the town burned down. I would argue a wooden town with very few fire services is going to have fires, and they could be anywhere. And again, we can see where these are located. So this is the main work on the abattoir site next door to us here. That's the Chantry Lane, Chantry Lands, and the ditches that were, the trenches that were put through the defences. And down here you've got the bathhouse, which we'll look at in more detail. That is the most excavated building in the whole town. We know more about the bathhouse, more of it's been excavated than any other. And then we have bits along the back over here. Now on this side, so far, between the road and the line of the defences, we're only producing very late material. We have yet to prove that that's otherwise, but at the moment the stuff that's coming out of the ground in the gardens is 17th, 18th century in date, 16th, 17th, 18th century in date, rather than Roman or medieval or Saxon. Whereas material from these gardens up here is producing medieval, quite early material and Roman. Professor Keith Ray has hypothesised that we have, going round Leintwardine, a Roman field system. Why would we have a Roman field system going around the outside? It's because if there were Roman people here or people from anywhere else, they would want to get the locals to start growing grain. And in fact, that's what did happen across the country. So it's quite clear we can see that. Professor Keith Ray goes further and says there is another external field system around that, which is even a Saxon in date. So we've got all these little bits of excavation all the way up, and these by no means are not all. There's about 100 and something altogether, little spots. And we're going to look now in brief what is told us. First of all, it was thought that under Chantry Land we had a mansio. And we do have a building there which would seem to be like a mansio. It's got stone foundations in its second phase, it's timber phase first, it has a lot of rooms, all of which would define it as being a mansio. We have another timber building down here which is probably equally grand but not stone, and we have some evidence in here that's different to what we had there. And here we have the excavated across the ditches, which we'll discuss later. Bathhouse down the bottom over here. The biggest collection of tableware, high quality tableware from the village comes from Sawpit Lane. The excavations that took place on Sawpit Lane, which is over there. Okay? Also, the only few pieces of military equipment were found in the same place, down here. Okay? No other features went with it. They were, to a large extent, unstratified. So, if we look at this again, just very briefly, what it looks like as though we have is, in the Iron Age, we have a small settlement by the river crossing. That's inferred from two things. One is that under the excavation of the Roman baths here, the very lowest level, evidence of wattle and daub buildings were found which are underneath it. And we know those must belong to at least sort of the 1st century, if not a little bit earlier. And then the Roman baths went over the top of it, allow us to see it. So it's evident, it's called layer 1A within the Roman baths sequence. What we have then is a small, probably settlement, probably store, cafe, whatever you'd like to call it in the Iron Age, by the water, keeping an eye on it, sorting out people going across or using the road. It's highly probable that this was an Iron Age road coming to the one good river crossing. Now what's interesting is as you move up into Shropshire, you'll find that the Roman road parallels the Iron Age road. So if you go to Craven Arms, you can see that the Roman road is about a quarter of a mile away from the Iron Age road with all of its enclosures around it. Now in the first iteration, that Roman road may well have been taxable, a toll road. If you used the road, you paid. So again, we're getting more to the military highway approach, running across. So that's how we see that there at this stage. Then we need to look at the areas around. Brandon Camp, AD 55-60, probably had nothing to do with Leintwardine at all. We can find no crossover evidence. It's not a typical Roman fort. It is an Iron Age fort that's been used to put a Roman site into it which used the defences. Okay, it's not big enough to hold 100 men. Okay, the site represents a rare example of a base, a Roman base that's put up, which is why everyone believes it's to do with a campaign. Okay, and I've said the road veers west. If you ever stand up there and look where the Roman road goes, it veers off to the east and appears quite different. It's got outlying ditches and all sorts, whereas if you look back towards Pato Lane, not only is it not altogether straight, it isn't wide enough as the same description going up past Wigmore. J Lane. Now J Lane is always seen as an auxiliary camp, cavalry unit, probably protecting the engineers which were doing or building the roads and keeping the peace in the area. It's Stamford who identified the cohort of being about probably 500 men and an ala quinquagenaria. Okay, it was excavated by Stamford in 1963, who excavated the corners, but the middle of the fort has been largely ploughed out. Okay, so what was happening at this time? The fort's in a beautiful position. You've got good views on all the way around it. You can see what's going on, but there's no river crossing underneath it. In this case, across the Clun. And so where was its civilian unit? Where was the civilian side to it? It's often thought that that was the start of Leintwardine. The civilian side developed on the river crossing, and there were civilians who supported the military men who were living down or moved over this way. And that may be true, because to a certain extent, within Leintwardine, we find pottery of this period and later in the 1st century. And it defies explanation. We can't put it down to anything in particular, certainly not a fort, certainly not to any sort of military exercise. So the only other thing would be sails. Now I have to say here, the main dating evidence that we use with Roman period at the moment for this lot is going to be pottery and coins. Now they provide a date after which, or looking the other way around, a date before which. In this case, the pottery is all imported. And to look at this, you have to say, right, okay, the military unit, the Roman military unit in England was the 4th biggest in the whole of the Roman Empire and comprised over 40,000 men. In terms of every year, there was a sum of money that was put out to pay the army, called the alima, and that was sent out annually. And on the process, they brought in wares from the continent, sailing wares and other things from other places which are highly dateable, and they became the main tableware. Now, in part, they were bought in by the army. In part, they were added to loads that were brought over by sea to here. And they provide us with the dating evidence. And they've been studied extensively, and it's quite specific, so it can tell us quite specific dates when these things were here. The second thing that I'll say, and this is in the development of Leintwardine, what do you actually think was the biggest industry in the Roman period? What was the thing that everybody needed, literally, and would make this country work?
Food.
No, it's haulage. If you think about it, you've got to get all these goods all the way around the country. You built the roads. How do you get them there? We know the Romans introduced donkeys. We know the Romans introduced a lot of others. So these places, like Leintwardine, probably acted as much as drove stations with supply horses, not just for the post, but also for all of the cattle, the wagons that were coming through carrying grain and other goods across the country. And this is particularly important because in the first and the beginning of the 2nd century, we found that all of the equipment that was coming in for the army is coming from abroad. Okay? Now, those industries on the continent that were providing this became fully industrialized. They were huge. Okay? And in this country, we just had one industry that really took off, and that was black burnish ware down by Poole. And in that particular case, it was there, and it was able to be added to the supply route going up around the country. The wagons that were moving around, the army brought it in and sent it around. And they were quite robust little bowls and jars. So it's quite interesting, really. This pottery is found in Leintwardine. We now know that there's not a viscus here, and we don't have any evidence of any settlement, civilian settlement, developing on the outside of the Roman fort. So the assumption is that whatever civilian settlement there was in Leintwardine. Okay, then we move to Buckton. Now the thing is that it would seem that J Lane is taken apart, dismantled after a relatively short period of time, and it was literally moved over to Buckton. They chose a nice site over there, they transferred all the materials across, including the detachment, and there are 2 phases to the construction of that fort. The first phase was a timber series like this, which would have been very similar to J Lane, and the second phase, they started rebuilding in stone. And that's quite important because when that is ended, the materials from that site are brought to Leintwardine and they're used in its development. And we can tell this from the stones that we found in the church, in the bathhouse and in other places. And it would seem that where Buckton's concerned, they were quarrying the red sandstones and bringing them in, and they're the ones which come over, and we can tell that they were previously, we can see how they were dug out from the buildings in Buckton. Right, these are the 2 forts. I've only shown them for illustration purposes. You can see the shape of them. They're broadly similar in shape and size. More detail was found on Buckton, and this is the later rebuilt version of Buckton, because the whole of the middle area here was rebuilt in the 2nd phase. And Stanford, when he was thinking about this, tried to fit this pattern into Leintwardine. So this is the plan that Stanford produced of his excavations and how they fitted, and he described that as a Roman fort, which would have had the principal road, which is High Street or Watling Street coming down that way, and a road across this way. The later excavations that Brown worked showed that this bit didn't exist. This bit, we did find a gate over here. There's part of a gate over there, we think. So that link out that way did exist. Exactly how that worked otherwise is another problem. But you can see the issue. Now, that plan over there shows you again the excavated areas and the line of the defences as they are shown by all those excavations. And that is including data which wasn't available to Stanford at the time. You'll note here that just above the lion, we've got the bathhouse, sitting right down here. This we're still working on and needs a lot more work doing, whether it's period 2 annex, whether it's a bit around the edge or bottom or not. But it's a funny shape on the corners, as you'll probably gather. Right, Leintwardine 1. Now, this is my breakdown based on all of that work that we've looked at so far. And if you look at Leintwardine 1, you would say, right, it's before AD 130. And why is it before AD 130? Well, it's before AD 130 for several reasons. The first mention of Bravonium comes from this period when it is named as Bravio. Okay, and it's the end of this period, it's the beginning of the next period. Sorry, I'm mixing myself up here. Okay, what we have then in this period, this early period, I'm moving ahead too fast to myself. You've got the main road which runs up through here to the crossing here, which could have been a ford, and it probably did have some sort of bridging, but it had a ford. The high ground of the bottom of there was probably utilised to actually act as some form of defence, but we don't know for sure. Then we have ribbon development happening all the way up the road. Now that means we've got enclosures which are coming out and probably came out as far as this line here on both sides, and that was very haphazard and he worked his way up, and it was a series of different sized plots, very typical of a sort of Iron Age or unplanned type development alongside the road. These would have been shops, they would have been workshops, shops, and they would have been areas where people lived at the back. And initially, that would have been fairly haphazard. But as time developed and became more Romanized, that would change. Okay? So for the first early settlement, we see as a ribbon development running down the road on either side. The second phase is that Bravonio appears in the Antonine itinerary. Bravonio has been identified as Bravarium, which is Leintwardine. Now, the interesting thing with that is it is 2nd century in date, but it means that in Rome, somebody could pick up a map or look at a map and see Leintwardine on it 2,000 years ago, which is quite significant, really. We get the first phase of the bathhouse, and we get Manzio-type buildings. Well, undoubtedly the Manzio would have actually housed all your important guests. The post coming up the road, the chap, the official in charge, and who's running the place and who's responsible, and any important guests running up the road would be housed there. But it's highly likely we needed a load of other accommodation for other travellers, like drovers and the people bringing things through. We also needed secure places for those people to stop overnight. Now, if we go up the road to Wroxeter, where a lot of this will be travelling, Wroxeter has the largest cattle area in the whole of the Roman Britain. It's the largest cattle market that we've found. And it may well be that we were supplying cattle from here up there as part of the tax that would have been payable. Actually went round that ribbon development and enclosed it. And it goes up the road. It's still covering quite a large area. And that was one of the points that Stamford made, was that that is big enough to hold a legion. It's much bigger than Jay Lane or the other forts. However, of all those little excavations that we've got over the place, we've not found any evidence of any of the military buildings. No barracks, no cavalry buildings, nothing like that at all. No, and more particularly, no granaries. So what we've got then is what appears to be a completely civilian settlement. And then we get imported into it the Manzio. It takes on importance, and it does take on some importance, because within the matter of the end of this period, by 190, they're putting defences around it. But at this stage, it's still open. And this is where it gets quite interesting, because if you're a Roman army and you're coming back and you're going to Romanise this town, you've got a ribbon development, it's in a good place, you want it there, There's no new campaigns coming through here during this period of time, so there's no army presence. You look at and see how you can fit into that ribbon development. And we see immediately that it's divided. That on this side, that is a split between what effectively was the extension of all of those haphazard areas across. And it becomes a physical boundary. If you look at this area here under the bank, and you go down High Street, you'll see that it's on a level platform. That may be part of the original Roman levelling of that area as part of a public space, agora or whatever. So we've got all of the signs on this side of, in fact, Roman intrusion. We have a bathhouse that's put outside in an area which doesn't intrude on all of those enclosures. So it looks very much as though it's been shoehorned in to the existing ribbon development that we had up the river, up the road, which is really quite interesting from that point of view. Okay, the defences. As I said, you know about the defences? Quite specific in Leintwardine, they're timber laced. They would have required a massive amount of timber, as I'll show in a minute. And they go over the top of the archaeology of periods 1 and 2. Now, this has been allocated to the Claudius Albinus and his attempt to take over to be the emperor. And it caused a lot of unrest, and we see a lot of Roman towns at that stage being defended, having ditches put round. The Roman defences. I'll put this up because I think it is quite important. It would have looked something like this. You've got a huge bank which is built up with layers of timber, logs, and clay. Just think how much that timber has got to be brought in for round Leintwardine to cover it all the way around. And the evidence is that it does go all the way around. And then it would have brushwood, turf and clay on top of that. And then the palisade or timber structure at the top with a ditch on the outside. Now, the interesting thing with this is that this ditch is actually within these enclosures. So the people who are occupying these enclosures must have all agreed some rate to that ditch being enclosed in their land and not encroaching on the fields on the outside. Now, I know there's a scarp on this side, which is quite clear. And this seems to be there seems to have been some sort of scarp down this side. And they may have been constraining factors as well. But it would seem as though the defences, when they were put up, were consensual with the people who were here. We don't believe there was a full military garrison, but we do believe they might have drawn down an auxiliary team to lead in the construction of the defences around the town. So we move on now to the 3rd century. Now we have the evidence we have of the 3rd century is quite interesting. There's not a lot going on, okay, and we would see it fairly slow. Now remember, the prosperity of Leintwardine is the volume of traffic that comes down the road. So if we don't have any campaigns going on, and if we don't have other things happening with the military context, that is not going to be particularly fruitful. If we don't have a military presence here, we're not going to get any benefit from the alima or the Roman money going through. So effectively, this might this sort of stagnation that Stamford describes might be very real, and for that particular reason. The interesting thing here, though, when we get into the 3rd century, is this: all of those industrialised industries on the continent started to get under a lot of pressure because of barbarian attacks. And most of them collapsed. So we stopped getting the supplies of the fine tableware, the samin and other things, following that. And the response locally is to industrialise our own industries. Now that meant that these become a lot more self-sufficient. We're starting to sell to the military. We're starting to produce the pottery here in industrialised factories, which are selling to the military and also to the local area. And we got plenty of pottery of this. But what we do have is that the buildings that we've got, there is a continuity. It's built on top of the original buildings that are there. That suggests that it's the same people or the same families moving forward in time through the Roman period. Okay, at that particular time, we had a lot of the wealth was concentrated within the villa estates rather than the town. Now, the background evidence here has been a huge study on the east of the country, around Yorkshire and across, huge one, which has been quite clear in showing that the Romans occupied sites within a occupied landscape, well occupied. There was a lot of people living here who were native, who were Celts, intermingling with the Romans. And it's highly likely that most of the villages that we see around us belonged to that period and were operating in relation to Leintwardine before it became a Roman town and afterwards. So that's, from that point of view, then that provides you with all the networks that would have come into here and would have been using the place. And in that context, we've got bits of lead that turned up in the bathhouse, which has a whole list of names on. Now, whether it was the cleaners of the bathhouse, or whether it was the people who were using it, or whether it was just literally a marker off a chest where they kept their clothes while they had a bath, we don't know. What we do know is half those names are Celtic in origin. We published this in the journal so people could see it, and we have more Celtic names from Leintwardine than anywhere else in the country. They all belong to the 3rd century. They were found a scrap in a ditch in the bathhouse when it was remodelled in the 4th century. So they belong to this period of time, which shows you that we had a mixture of Roman, local people who were interfering with it or interfacing with it in the same, by and large with each other. And maybe the attempt was to Romanise the Celts by getting them to use the bathhouse. One way or another. Either cleaning it or washing, you never know. So it's thought that a lot of the wealth was concentrated in villa estates rather than towns, because we've got a very settled landscape. We've got people buying into villas. We don't really have the villas around here. Either they've yet to be found or they were moving elsewhere when they retired. So there doesn't seem to be any major rebuilding, and the only thing we do have is repairs to the bathhouse happening at this time. So in the 4th century, then we see a reorganisation of the supply networks. We see that to the military, we see local production filling the need of the military, and that actually has an economic revival to small towns. So instead of all the wealth going off to the main governor of the country and being carted away, either in goods in kind and surplus, what you see is that developing here and being paid for here, and the wealth developing in the town. And we see rebuilding going on. The bathhouse is rebuilt at that stage. So the 4th century, we might see an awful lot, or might expect to see. Now, we do get a lot of evidence of this in terms of coinage and pottery across, but not really the features that would really help us with it. And this is, to some extent, a product of the archaeology, because the archaeology at the time was probably, we would get about twice, if not 3 times as much information out of an excavation now than they did then. And that's important to recognise, although it was very good for its time. So the bathhouse. This is the plan of the bathhouse. It shows what it was done, and you can see the periods on there. Just very briefly, because time's probably going to be pressing on me, what you've got is the fact that this area here, which is period 3-4, was a complete rebuild and a reversion. So the hot rooms are at one end, and then later on the rebuild they're at the other end. So it's quite complicated. Now, this is a medium-sized bathhouse. It's not huge. It's not the same as Bath. It's quite extensive, and it would have satisfied 500 men quite easily, and people travelling through. So, what did the town actually look like? And here I'm thinking of the model, which started this all off for me. And in the Iron Age, Iron Age Leintwardine, we've got small wattle and daub buildings which would have been situated around the crossroads area down here, and along with the river crossing and the road, which is probably at that stage Iron Age, continuing on up there. Now it's highly likely J Lane was an Iron Age road, the same as this lane over here, going up past Kinton. There's no reason why they weren't Iron Age at all. It is the Roman road that goes up from there and cuts right the way across the landscape in order to get up to Craven Arms. Okay, then we look at the first period, AD 50 to 130. I put 50 to 130 because that spans then the period of J Lane. We have pottery of that period that turns up in the town. It shows that there is a certain amount of civilian involvement in the development of houses or development of properties along this front. And what we probably begin to see is the development of shops. Now, if you look at other Roman towns, what have you got on here? You've got fast food, you've got metalworking, you have got leatherworking, you've got cloth, you've got a whole series of different industries along there. We have no excavation at the moment, which is on the edge of the road. All right, all we're going on here is what's happened in every other town that we found. These would have been shuttered on the front. They would have had shutters to seal them off and protect them at night. You'd have come into the town, you'd have been able to use any of these shops. You've got behind that accommodation which you could stay in depending on your status and on both sides. And it's highly likely that in these areas here were starting to be developed as proper quasi-Roman areas rather than necessarily pure civilian areas. Okay, we get into the period of 130 to 190, and this is when I think it consolidates. We know we've got evidence of a temple, the temple which is rare for a small town. We know we've got a bathhouse, which is also rare for a small town. The statue, the inscribed altar, I think came from somewhere down this area, but it was in somebody's rockery. It's not from an excavation or in context. It's highly likely what we're getting at the moment is a picture of a series of public buildings which have been on this side. And these are quite important. And if any of you go and have a look around the outside of the church, look at all the tile that's in the wall of the church and the cement, and what you'll see is Roman tile, Roman opposite cement from very floors, they're hypercoarse roof and wall tile. So it looks as though the Roman church is actually built on quite a substantive Roman site. Now the evidence from the graveyard is that you go 6 to 8 feet down, you hit a layer of burning, and then you hit the Roman material. I don't know how many graves that was in. I don't know who got the privilege of being 8 foot down. Never mind. So it might well be in this period that what we see is the local town civic side, if you like, appearing, and actually then splitting off all of these haphazard enclosures on this side and giving us the evidence for where those public areas were. Marketplace. We've got then the major area here, Saltpit Lane, of the which has given us the best tablewares, which would have been fine dining, which might be associated with our actual Mancio of where the main official lived. And he probably may have had a small contingent in here, which used his protection, and which actually provided protection within the town. And it might be somewhere in this area, then he's got the bathhouse and the temple. So it's highly exciting, and I would put most of this is from what we've seen from the excavation in that period in the 2nd century. The development of that was up to the point when we get the defences putting in. The defences then, they come in and they are on those same plots that we see, they truncate them. And so what we see is that those big banks were slumping, which is why we've got quite shallow banks like that. If you look on this side, the town, because the tall bank has slumped down over time. And then in the 3rd century, we see the development of the motorway station type approach. We've got fast food, haulage, repairs for equipment, journey supplies, accommodation, and other less tasteful elements that the Romans took on board. There was no new scale redevelopment, probably due to the lack of military activity, area and road usage. And the economic upheaval abroad meant that the local industries were adapting to and providing for the local military and the local officials, which brought the money in and meant that it was enclosed within these small settlements. So across the country, we see that revival in these small towns. And then in the 4th century, I think this is quite important, because if we look at what happens in the 4th century in a lot of the cities around us and a lot of the larger places, we see lots of open areas. And what we see in that latter period is the development of gardens, fine living, otium, as the Romans used to call it, where back you're talking about luxury and fine eating. And the Romans introduced all of these new vegetables, pears, plums, damsons, cherries and walnuts. And the vegetables that we're all currently with today, all were introduced by the Romans. That's leeks, cucumber, this is only a short list of them actually. Leeks, cucumber, and they introduced a load of herbs alongside this. So they were very keen on their cooking and making good dishes. And we see quite a lot of that happening, I think, in these back areas. So we've still got the shops at the front, we've got the living areas, and then the rear of the plots probably get developed as gardens, because they're providing that high quality food for the tables of the people coming through. Again, the evidence from the archaeology suggests that we have got a level of continuity in terms of the plots going through here. So we've got these 3 pictures, if you like, of what early Leintwardine looked like. To start with, it's the ribbon development running up the road. And then we get the first buildings of the Mancio, and that is probably contingent in the 2nd century with its appearance on the national or international map, the itinerary. And effectively, we have got in that period the first encroachment of that official Roman onto this ribbon landscape of civilian holdings. And that starts to adapt quite fast, because there doesn't seem to have been any opposition to the building of the defences. It seems to have been almost welcomed. They've got it on their properties. They've built their bits round. They probably had some responsibilities with keeping it maintained on their properties. So all in all, what you see is a level of consensual movement towards how that's gone. And they've probably brought in a bigger military contingent to help them do that. Okay, and then in the 4th century we see that development, and we see gardens turning up, producing these fine goods as much as we would like to do today. And those are the 3 pictures really that I think would be really important for us to put into a good model of how the Roman town looked. And bear in mind that the Roman army left in AD 410. That's another story. And I will leave it there. That's all right.
Thanks so much, Terry. You've given us a very comprehensive view of Roman history in Leintwardine. That answers the question in the Monty Python film, what did the Romans ever do for us? Well, I think there's quite a lot that they did for us. Anyway, there is time for a few questions. So would anybody like to kick it off?
Terry, I was wondering if we know what staple food was in Leintwardine before the Romans brought in all the things that we take for granted nowadays.
The state of
Food.
food.
What we would have eaten
Ah,
before
well,
the Romans brought in
probably
the staples.
it would be barbecue. And in terms of vegetables, the only one that we know they used was henbane. Yeah, fat hen. Fat hen. And indeed, that carried on to be used. And that's the only one we have got pollen evidence for in the Iron Age. Okay? Interestingly, though, once the Romans leave, after 410, and they go into the Saxon period, we lose the gardens. We have no pollen evidence at that later date of those vegetables still being produced.
Do you want to?
Anybody who's been to the health centre will have seen the Roman pottery in the cabinet there. So that's outside the defences. What was going on there, and why was it there?
Two things happened there. One is that it's part of a small farm, which you'd have on the outskirts. And secondly, burials in the Roman period were always outside the gates of the town.
There is some at Burrington, isn't there?
Pardon?
There are some Roman graves at
There are
Burrington.
Roman graves up there, yes.
So,
And they would have been alongside the road all the way up. So the pottery comes from that, really. Is that helpful? There is a good report on that. If you're interested in looking at it more, then that has been done.
Is there another question? Francesca. Thanks.
Terry, thank you for that. That was the sources that you mentioned at the very beginning. I would assume I could find that in the history room.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, some of it's online as well.
I think is it Joe wants to ask a question?
Yeah, I just wondered, in the chronology of the church, would they have built a kind of Roman temple or similar over a Celtic place of worship, or what was the chronology of from the start?
Well, you're right in terms of that did happen elsewhere. We have no evidence of it here whatsoever, unfortunately, at the moment. What may have happened here is that it's the Romans' official areas which collapse, and that there was a clinging on to the occupancy of the other tenements, because when the Romans were gone, we're still using the road. And you have to remember that the Watling Street became the military highway of the Saxon period. So if you look at the Saxon period and how they moved their armies around, throughout the whole of that period, it was down these roads. So effectively it was going on. But it might well be that they became decrepit and dangerous. The problem is we don't have any evidence whatsoever except for this Roman material. When I worked on the excavations at Ely, and they put their Christian site straight on top of the shrine, if you like, to the gods that they were using there. There's a variety in that one. And I think the issue there is that you could see that happen whichever way. So I think the history of our current church more belongs to the Saxon period than it does the Roman.
Thank you.
I think Adrian's got a question.
Just a very quick bit of clarity. I'm just checking. You've mentioned Watling Street several times, and since arriving here not so long ago, I've picked up that Watling Street moved at some point. Yes.
Yes. Sorry.
So when you're talking about Watling Street, are you talking about what is now High Street?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That is the Watling Street.
Okay. And so when did it switch?
The name Watling Street on there is relatively late.
Okay. So when did...
Earlier names show East Road and Swan Lane, Swan Road, are both names that were being used for that in documents.
Right.
Up until relatively recently. And Watling Street was this road here, going down. And it's the main Roman road.
Anybody driving through the village now must notice that it's a valley.
Yes.
People delivering to the houses on the right-hand side and the left-hand side must also realise it's a valley. Did the Romans level anything out, or was it a valley?
Well, you've hit on a really good point. We have a lot of soil in this place we can't account for, to put it in a nice way. If you look at the abattoir site next door to us here, it would seem as though the level of the Romans is on the same level as the road. If you go down 8 foot in the church, you're on the same level as the road. So it seems a lot of this was originally down at that level and has been built up. And I think one of the things that we're going to look for when we go and see the assemblages is to see what metalwork there is that relates to animals. Not necessarily horses, but animals. Okay, and if we've got any evidence in there of that, because it may well be that the big industry along this side here was swapping teams over, feeding them up so they could be swapped again, and they were the people who were keeping if you like, the economy of the Roman Britain working by actually providing those teams. Because this is on a marker point, so it's 15 miles through to the next place, 15, 20 miles, seem to be as a walking distance for a legion. But if you've got all that stuff being travelled up by cart and whatever, you're going to know about it. You just look at the depths of the ruts in Pompeii. You can see the level of cart use they're doing. So it must have been massive amount of animals that they required just to haul that stuff around. And if you think about the, well over 1 million logs that were going to be needed to provide our defences, how did they get them here? They've got to bring them in on log. You're not going to pack all those in. So haulage. But I think a lot of this lot will relate to haulage. And the look at the metalwork is to see where we've got metalwork from carts and other things for tackling those animals up to those carts. And I think we'll probably find evidence of that. Later on in time, of course, that morphs slightly because it seems as though Leintwardine became known for its breeding of horses. So in Domesday Book for Shropshire, in the folio, it says on the front page that the king required all his horses to come from Leintwardine when he visited. That was King William, when he visited Shrewsbury. So we may have been the stable yard of the Mortimers. Yeah, sorry. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you again, Terry. That was a very comprehensive talk. So I hope people enjoyed that and found it very educational. So could I ask you to thank Terry again, please?